The American lieutenant stood at attention in the briefing tent. March 1968, Long Tan Fire Base, Phuoc Thu Province. Sweat ran down his collar despite the fan rotating overhead. Across the plywood table sat 3 Australian soldiers who had not stood when he entered, had not saluted, had barely looked up from their maps. The lieutenant was Navy SEAL Team 2, decorated, experienced, accustomed to respect. These Australians wore uniforms faded by jungle rot, boots held together with parachute cord, faces burned dark by sun that never reached through triple canopy. One of them was picking his teeth with a twig. Another was drinking tea from a canteen, cup like he had all day. The third finally glanced up and said they could start whenever the Americans were ready. No, sir. No rank acknowledgement. Nothing. The lieutenant felt heat rising in his chest that had nothing to do with Vietnam's climate. He had flown 4,000 miles to coordinate operations with allies who apparently had no concept of military courtesy. This was going to be a long deployment. Did you know that the most effective Allied partnership in the Vietnam War almost collapsed in its first week because Americans mistook professionalism for disrespect? 18 joint operations were canceled. 7 formal complaints filed. The Australian Defence Force called the American attitude catastrophically precious. You think cultural differences don't affect combat effectiveness? You're wrong. Because what happened next would save 240 American lives, produce the war's highest Allied cooperation ratings, and teach the Pentagon a lesson about leadership that contradicted everything West Point taught. Why did Australian soldiers refuse to salute officers in combat zones? What made men who had survived 3-year jungle deployments show such apparent contempt for rank structure? And what did the Americans discover that transformed their understanding of what respect actually means when death is the only consequence? That matters? Stay until the end, because the answer isn't in any field manual. It's something the Australians understood that took Americans 3 bloody months to learn. The cultural collision was inevitable from the moment American and Australian forces began coordinating in Phuoc Thu Province. The Americans arrived with expectations shaped by their own military culture-rigid rank structure, formal protocols, visible displays of hierarchy that reinforced the chain of command. These weren't arbitrary customs. They were the organizational principles that allowed the American military to function across millions of personnel, integrate complex logistics, and maintain discipline under conditions that broke lesser armies. American soldiers saluted officers. They stood when senior ranks entered a room. They used proper forms of address regardless of circumstances. This wasn't about ego. It was about system integrity, about maintaining structure when chaos threatened, to dissolve everything into individual survival instincts. The Americans had fought World War II this way, had conquered Europe and the Pacific using organizational discipline that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan couldn't match. They knew their system worked. They expected allies to understand this. They expected professional soldiers to recognize that military courtesy was an optional dot. The Australians had fought World War II differently. They had served under British command in North Africa, where rigid British class structures had gotten Australian soldiers killed in poorly planned operations. They had fought in New Guinea, where Japanese forces had learned that targeting officers first would paralyze British-trained units. They had survived campaigns where the enemy specifically watched for salutes because salutes identified leaders, and leaders made priority targets. The Australians had learned lessons written in the blood of men who died because someone showed respect at the wrong moment. By Vietnam, those lessons had crystallized into doctrine. In operational areas, rank didn't exist. Officers earned authority through competence, not through bars on their collars. Salutes were forbidden because they told the enemy who mattered. The formal address was eliminated because it created a vulnerability. Every visible marker of hierarchy was stripped away, leaving only the raw fact of who could keep men alive and who couldn't. This wasn't disrespectful. This was survival. But to American eyes, it looked like chaos. It looked like an army that didn't understand discipline. It looked like disrespect. The first joint operation was Reconnaissance Patrol in War Zone D, an area where Viet Cong forces operated with near impunity. SEAL Team 2 provided 8 men. The Australians provided a 4-man SAS patrol. The mission brief called for 5 days in deep jungle, gathering intelligence on enemy supply routes. The American lieutenant commanding the operation expected to lead. He had seniority. He had more men. He had combat experience across 3 deployments. The Australian sergeant commanding their element was younger, lower ranked on paper, and apparently unimpressed with American credentials. The sergeant suggested the Americans might want to operate independently, meet at the extraction point in 5 days, share information then. The lieutenant said that wasn't how joint operations worked. Someone had to command. The sergeant shrugged and said to the jungle commander, "Men either listened to it or died." That wasn't philosophy. That was a fact. The lieutenant felt his jaw tighten. This was exactly the attitude headquarters had warned about. Australians who thought their limited experience in a small operational area somehow made them experts. The lieutenant had trained at Coronado, had operated across the entire Mekong Delta, and had seen more combat than this sergeant would see in a career. The arrogance was astounding. They were inserted by helicopter at dawn. 12 men dropping into elephant grass that closed over them like water. The Americans moved into patrol formation immediately, textbook perfect, exactly as trained. The Australians waited, watching, making no move to fall in. The lieutenant gestured them forward. The sergeant shook his head. Too fast. The lieutenant said they had distance to cover before dark. The sergeant said distance didn't matter if you were dead. The Australian patrol began moving at their own pace, perhaps 1/3 the American speed, with constant security halts. That seemed excessive to the SEALs. The lieutenant faced a choice: maintain his pace and split the patrol, or slow down to accommodate allies who apparently needed extra time to do basic infantry work. He slowed down. The resentment was visible on American faces. They were being held back by allies who moved like they were on a nature walk rather than a combat operation. By midday, the Americans had stopped trying to maintain proper tactical formation. They were just following the Australians, watching them perform security procedures that seemed paranoid. Halt for threats that didn't exist. Spend 5 minutes observing before moving through areas that looked completely clear. On the second day, the Australian leading the patrol stopped abruptly. He crouched, examining something on the ground. The Americans saw nothing. Jungle floor, leaves, normal. Terrain. The Australian traced his finger along a pattern in the disturbed vegetation. The lieutenant couldn't see any pattern. The Australian said 12 men had passed here within the last 6 hours, moving north, carrying heavy loads. The Americans examined the ground more carefully. Nothing. No footprints. No obvious disturbance. The Australian pointed at broken spider webs, at leaves turned wrong side up, at compressed moss that would recover its shape within another 3 hours. He read the jungle the way others read text. This wasn't advanced tracking. This was basic fieldcraft that every Australian soldier learned because the alternative was walking into ambushes. The Americans had tracking training. They had learned to follow obvious trails, identify boot prints, and spot major disturbances. They had never learned to read the 1,000 subtle signals that the jungle broadcast constantly to anyone who knew the language. The Australian sergeant suggested they alter their route. The lieutenant agreed. 6 hours later, they heard sustained. firefight 2 clicks away, exactly where their original route would have taken them. The Americans said nothing. Neither did the Australians. But something had shifted. On the third day, the lieutenant tried to radio a status report to headquarters. Standard procedure. Maintain communication. The Australian sergeant physically stopped him, hand on the radio, shaking his head. Radio discipline in operational areas meant complete silence unless emergency extraction was needed. The VC monitored American radio frequencies, triangulated positions, and learned American communication patterns well enough to anticipate operations based purely on radio traffic analysis. The lieutenant said he had to report. The sergeant asked, what was more important? Headquarters knowing you're fine, or staying alive to complete the mission? The lieutenant had never framed the question that way. American doctrine assumed you could do both, maintain communication and maintain security. The Australians had learned otherwise. Every transmission was a compromise, a trade of information for vulnerability. Sometimes the trade was necessary. Usually it wasn't. The lieutenant kept the radio silent. That evening, headquarters sent an angry message demanding a status update. The Australians ignored it. The Americans watched them ignore it, watched them violate direct orders from senior command without apparent concern. This wasn't disrespectful. This was prioritization. The mission mattered. The headquarters' administrative comfort didn't. The distinction seemed obvious to the Australians. It seemed almost treasonous to the Americans. By the fourth day, the Americans were moving differently. They had stopped maintaining their own formation and were simply mimicking Australian movement. When the Australians stopped, they stopped. When the Australians observed, they observed. When the Australians altered course based on signals the Americans couldn't detect, they followed without question. Their resentment had transformed into something else. Not quite respected yet. More like recognition that their training, comprehensive as it was, hadn't prepared them for this specific environment against this specific enemy. The Australians weren't better soldiers. They were soldiers shaped by different constraints. And those constraints had taught lessons the Americans had never needed to learn. American forces operated with helicopter support, artillery on call, medical evacuation within minutes, supply chains that could deliver hot food to firebase perimeters. The Australians operated with none of that. They went into the jungle with what they carried and stayed until the mission was complete or they died. There was no cavalry coming. There was no air support to call. There was just the patrol, the jungle, and the enemy. Under those conditions, you learned different skills. You developed different priorities. You stopped wasting energy on things that didn't affect survival. Realization that changed everything came on the fifth day. The patrol had reached its observation point, overlooking a suspected supply route. The position offered good concealment, but required remaining motionless for hours. The Americans settled in, maintaining proper positions. The Australian sergeant crawled over to the lieutenant. He didn't salute, didn't use rank, spoke quietly, directly, like he was talking to an equal. He said the lieutenant's men were positioned wrong, too exposed. If VC spotters checked, the realization that changed everything came on the fifth day. The patrol had reached its observation point, overlooking a suspected supply route. The position offered good concealment, but required remaining motionless for hours. The Americans settled in, maintaining proper positions. The Australian sergeant crawled over to the lieutenant. He didn't salute, didn't use rank, spoke quietly, directly, like he was talking to an equal. He said the lieutenant's men were positioned wrong, too exposed. If VC spotters checked this ridgeline, they would see silhouettes against the sky. The lieutenant started to object, started to explain. His positioning logic then stopped. He looked at where his men were positioned. The sergeant was right. The lieutenant repositioned his team without argument, without explanation, without asserting his authority. The sergeant nodded and crawled back to his position. That nod carried more respect than any salute. It said, "You learned." The lieutenant understood something then. The Australians hadn't been disrespectful. They had been testing, watching to see if Americans could adapt, could learn, could prioritize survival over ego. Every interaction that had felt like insubordination had actually been evaluated. The Australians needed to know if these Americans would get them killed. The patrol extracted on schedule with intelligence that shaped operations for the next 2 months. The lieutenant filed his after-action report with unusual honesty. He noted that Australian tactical procedures exceeded SEAL capabilities in jungle reconnaissance. He noted that Australian fieldcraft represented institutional knowledge American forces lacked. He noted that what appeared to be discipline problems were actually sophisticated operational security measures. He recommended immediate cross-training. He also recommended that American personnel receive cultural briefing on Australian military customs before joint operations. The report went up the chain to MSEV headquarters in Saigon, where staff officers read it with skepticism. This was a Navy SEAL lieutenant, part of the most elite force in the American military, saying that Australians with outdated equipment and apparently casual discipline were more effective than his own men. The institutional resistance was immediate. SEALs didn't need lessons from Allied forces. SEALs were the instructors, not the students. The report was filed and largely ignored, but copies circulated among operators who actually worked in the field, and those men paid attention. They had seen the Australian results. They had watched small Australian patrols operate in areas where American company-sized elements got shredded. What the Americans initially perceived as disrespect was actually a completely different command philosophy. American military doctrine was built on the principle of hierarchy. Officers commanded, enlisted obeyed. This created clear decision-making structures that functioned even under extreme stress. When chaos erupted, men defaulted to following orders because the habit was trained into them. The system worked. It had worked for decades, but it created dependencies. American soldiers often waited for orders rather than acting independently. They looked to their officers for decisions. They expected leadership to come from rank. The Australian system, refined through decades of operating as small forces far from support, functioned differently. Officers earned authority through demonstrated competence. A lieutenant who made poor decisions would find his suggestions ignored by sergeants who knew better. A captain who couldn't read terrain would be quietly corrected by corporals with more experience. Rank existed for administrative purposes. In the field, only competence mattered. This wasn't democracy. It wasn't disrespectful. It was pragmatism refined into doctrine. When 4 men operate alone in the jungle for weeks at a time, the luxury of following bad orders doesn't exist. You follow competence, regardless of where it comes from, or you die. The symbolic object that crystallized this difference was something simple: a cup of tea. The Australians stopped for tea twice daily, regular as clockwork, no matter what else was happening. They would halt patrol, boil water, brew tea, sit and drink it slowly. To American observers, this looked insane. You didn't stop tactical operations for refreshment. You maintained momentum. You stayed focused. The Australians saw it differently. The tea break was a tactical pause disguised as routine. It forced regular security halts. It created opportunities to observe the environment without the distraction of movement. It gave men time to identify problems before they became crises. But more than tactical value, the tea represented something deeper about Australian military culture. Officers and enlisted drank the same tea from the same canteen cups. They sat together without ceremony. They spoke freely without regard to rank. The tea break was the daily ritual that reinforced the operational reality. In the field, they were just men with a job to do, and hierarchy was an administrative fiction that didn't survive contact with the jungle. Americans initially saw this as unprofessional. Eventually, they understood it was professionalism of a different kind. Professionalism that said the mission mattered more than anyone's ego, and survival required honest assessment rather than deferential agreement. The cultural transformation began spreading through SEAL teams in April 1968. Operators who had worked with Australians started adopting their methods. Not officially, not through training programs, just individual decisions to try techniques that seemed effective. American patrols began moving slower, observing longer. They reduced radio communication. They stopped wearing rank insignia in operational areas. Small changes, barely visible, but they produced measurable results. Casualty rates dropped. Intelligence gathering improved. Enemy contact decreased because American forces were learning to avoid the enemy rather than seeking them out. This last point was particularly significant. American doctrine emphasized aggressive patrolling, seeking contact, destroying enemy forces through superior firepower. The Australians emphasized avoidance, observation, engagement only when necessary or advantageous. The American approach worked when you had unlimited support and casualty tolerance. The Australian approach worked when you didn't. SEALs operated in small teams, often without immediate support, in environments where casualties couldn't be easily replaced. The Australian model matched their operational reality better than their own doctrine did. But adopting it required abandoning assumptions about what professional military culture looked like. The resistance came from headquarters elements that never operated in the field. Staff officers saw the reports about reduced saluting, informal address, and apparent casualty of discipline. They saw SEALs adopting foreign procedures without authorization. They saw what looked like the erosion of good order and discipline. The Marine Corps was particularly critical. Marines built their entire culture on respect for rank, precision, in military courtesy and visible hierarchy. They saw the Australian influence as corrosive, likely to spread to conventional forces and undermine the organizational principles that made the American military function. The criticism intensified when photographs surfaced of American and Australian troops during joint operations. The Australians looked like guerrillas' faded uniforms, non-standard equipment, no visible rank, informal posture. The Americans with them looked similar. To generals in air-conditioned offices, this looked like failure. To men in the jungle, it looked like survival. The disconnect was total. Headquarters wanted procedures. The field wanted results. Headquarters valued appearance. The field valued effectiveness. Neither side could understand the other's priorities because they operated in completely different contexts. Lieutenant Commander James Warren became the unlikely bridge between these worlds. Warren was SEAL Team 1, highly decorated, politically astute, capable of speaking both headquarters language and operator language. He had worked extensively with Australian SAS and understood what made their system function. In June 1968, he wrote a classified memo that circulated through Naval Special Warfare Command. The memo was titled Professional Respect versus Social Courtesy, Learning from Allied Forces. Warren argued that Americans conflated two separate concepts: social courtesy saluting, formal address. Visible hierarchy served important functions in garrison environments and conventional operations. But professional respect trusting competence, honest communication, mission focus required different expressions in small unit operations. The Australians had separated these concepts. They maintained social courtesy in rear areas where it served organizational purposes. They abandoned it in operational areas where it created vulnerabilities. This wasn't disrespectful. This was a contextual adaptation. Warren recommended American Special Operations Forces adopt similar flexibility, maintain military courtesy where appropriate, abandon it where it compromised effectiveness, judge allies by results rather than appearance. The memo was controversial. It was also correct. The proof came in August 1968 during Operation Coburg, a major Allied offensive in Bien Hoa Province. Australian forces located a regiment-sized NVA force preparing to attack the provincial capital. The intelligence came from 5-man Australian SAS patrols that had been operating in the area for 3 weeks, moving slowly, observing constantly, radioing only when critical information emerged. American forces had operated in the same area and found nothing because they moved too quickly, communicated too frequently, and followed patterns the NVA had learned to avoid. The Australian intelligence allowed coordinated response that prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack. The operation killed or scattered more than 1,000 NVA soldiers at minimal Allied cost. The Australian role was undeniable. Their methods had produced strategic intelligence that American methods had missed. After Coburg, the institutional resistance began to crack. Maybe the Australians understood something worth learning. Maybe professional effectiveness looked different than American tradition assumed. Maybe respect meant trusting someone to do their job rather than expecting them to perform deference. The transformation accelerated through late 1968 and into 1969. Joint training programs were established, not to teach Australians American methods, but for Americans to learn Australian methods. SEAL teams rotated through Australian training courses, where they learned fieldcraft from scratch. They learned to move silently, to read terrain, to operate without support for extended periods. They learned that leadership in small units emerged from competence rather than rank, that orders were starting points for discussion rather than endpoints, that the best decision might come from the newest team member if he was the one who saw the threat first. These lessons contradicted West Point doctrine. They contradicted Marine Corps' tradition. They contradicted the hierarchical assumptions that underlay American military culture. But they worked. Teams that absorbed Australian methods operated more effectively. Their survival rates improved. Their intelligence gathering became more valuable. The results were undeniable, even when the methods looked wrong to conventional eyes. What the Americans discovered was that respect is different. Languages depending on context. In garrison, respect means acknowledging hierarchy, following protocol, maintaining appearances that reinforce organizational structure. In combat, respect means something entirely different. It means trusting someone's judgment enough to follow their lead regardless of rank. It means being honest about threats, even when that means contradicting a superior. It means abandoning ceremony in favor of effectiveness. The Australian sergeant who didn't salute in the briefing tent wasn't being disrespectful. He was operating in combat mode, where salutes got people killed and rank meant nothing compared to knowledge. The American lieutenant who demanded recognition was operating in garrison mode, where hierarchy needed constant reinforcement. Neither was wrong. They were just speaking different languages. The conflict came from applying garrison expectations to combat environments. Once Americans understood this distinction, the apparent disrespect disappeared. What remained was professional. Respect of a purer kind, based entirely on whether someone could keep you alive, rather than whether they performed the proper courtesies. The symbolic importance of the T break grew as more Americans worked with Australians. SEAL teams began adopting the practice, not because they particularly cared about T, but because they understood what it represented. The T break was a forcing function for equality. When officers and enlisted sat together without rank markers, without formal address, Without social hierarchy, they could communicate honestly. The newest team member could point out problems without fear of contradicting authority. The most experienced operator could share knowledge without it being filtered through a chain of command. Problems got identified earlier. Solutions emerged from whoever had relevant expertise. The tea wasn't about caffeine. It was about creating space where rank couldn't interfere with effectiveness. Americans discovered that some of their operational failures had come from junior personnel staying silent rather than contradicting senior officers. Problems identified too late. Threats missed because someone didn't want to seem insubordinate. The Australian system prevented this by eliminating the social barriers that made honest communication difficult. The price was an apparent disorder. The benefit was survival. By 1970, the cultural integration was complete enough that joint operations functioned smoothly. Americans understood that Australians showed respect through actions rather than words, through trusting your competence rather than acknowledging your rank. Australians understood that Americans needed more explicit structure, more defined roles, more certainty about who was responsible for what decisions. Both sides adapted. Operations began with discussions that looked like negotiations, establishing for each mission who had relevant expertise, who would make which decisions, how information would be shared. Rank existed as a tiebreaker, but not as primary authority. The best-informed person led, regardless of what insignia they wore or didn't wear. This approach produced results that exceeded what either force achieved independently. Australian reconnaissance skills combined with American firepower and logistics created a hybrid capability that the enemy couldn't counter. Small Australian patrols found targets. American forces destroyed them. The cycle repeated across FUAC, to province and beyond, grinding down enemy capabilities to precision that neither ally could achieve alone. The transformation had costs. Some American officers never adapted. They couldn't separate ego from effectiveness. Couldn't accept input from subordinates. Couldn't function without visible hierarchy to reinforce their authority. These officers were quietly sidelined, given roles where their limitations wouldn't get anyone killed. The military bureaucracy protected them because the military bureaucracy valued conformity. But the operational community knew who could function in combat and who couldn't. Competence created its own hierarchy, and that hierarchy didn't always match what insignia suggested. This created tension with conventional forces, where rank meant more than capability. SEALs operating with Australian methods increasingly found themselves at odds with higher command. They resisted orders that contradicted operational reality. They reported through back channels when official channels were blocked by incompetent staff officers. They developed a reputation as difficult, undisciplined, disrespectful. The reputation was accurate. They were difficult for people who prioritized procedure over results. They were undisciplined by garrison standards. They were disrespectful toward authority that wasn't earned. But they were also effective in ways that conventional forces couldn't match. The Australian influence extended beyond tactics into leadership philosophy. American officers who worked with Australian SAS returned with a different understanding of what command meant. Command wasn't about giving orders. It was about creating conditions where the best decision emerged, regardless of who made it. The officer's job was to aggregate information, facilitate discussion, make final calls when consensus couldn't be reached, and take responsibility for outcomes. But the officer who made every decision personally was limiting his unit to his own knowledge and experience. The officer who created space for input from everyone was multiplying his effectiveness by the size of his team. This seemed obvious. Once stated, it contradicted American military tradition completely. American officers were trained to be decisive, to project confidence, to make command decisions without consultation, because consulting looked weak. The Australian model said decisiveness without information was stupidity, confidence without competence was arrogance, and command decisions made in isolation were usually wrong. The best American officers absorbed this lesson. The worst ones never understood it. The difference was measurable in casualty rates. Lieutenant Michael Patterson represented the successful transformation. Patterson was SEAL Team 2, commissioned from enlisted ranks, without academy pedigree or connected family. He had worked with Australian SAS during 3 operations before taking his own command. His first briefing with his new team violated every protocol. He sat with them rather than standing. He asked what they thought should be done rather than telling them. When disagreements emerged, he facilitated discussion rather than making command decisions. His enlisted men were uncertain initially. This wasn't how officers behaved. But when Patterson integrated their input into the final operational plan, when he credited their ideas explicitly, when he took responsibility for failures but shared credit for successes, the team's culture shifted. They stopped waiting for orders and started offering solutions. They stopped filtering information through what they thought Patterson wanted to hear and started reporting what he needed to know. The team's effectiveness increased measurably. Their intelligence gathering improved. Their casualty rate dropped to 0 across 12 months of continuous operations. Patterson's methods looked like weak leadership to conventional officers. To his men, they looked like the first officer who trusted them enough to listen. The Pentagon never officially acknowledged the Australian influence. No doctrine was rewritten. No training programs were modified formally. But the changes filtered through the special operations community like water through limestone, invisible but transformative. By the mid-1970s, when SEAL Team 6 was established, its organizational culture reflected Australian lessons without acknowledging their source. Team 6 operated with minimal visible hierarchy, emphasized competence over rank, selected personnel for capability rather than seniority, and created decision-making processes that pulled input from all sources. These characteristics were presented as innovations specific to counterterrorism requirements. Actually, they were Australian lessons learned in Vietnam and repackaged for American consumption. The repackaging was necessary because American military culture couldn't admit it had. Learned from allies it had initially dismissed. Institutional pride demanded that American effectiveness be presented as American innovation. The men who had learned from Australians understood the real history. They didn't care about credit. They cared about effectiveness, the symbolic power of that first encounter in the briefing tent grew over time. The story was repeated in training courses, in after-action discussions, in the informal education that shapes military culture. The American lieutenant stood rigid, expecting salutes. The Australian soldiers sitting, drinking tea, ignoring rank. The mutual incomprehension. The eventual understanding. The story became a teaching parable about the difference between ceremony and substance, about learning from unexpected sources, about the danger of confusing professionalism with protocol. Different versions emphasized different lessons. Some versions made the Americans look foolish. Some made the Australians look insubordinate. The best versions made both sides look human men, shaped by different experiences, carrying different assumptions, needing to bridge genuine cultural gaps before they could work together. The bridge was built, not through policy directives or official programs, but through individual relationships between men who needed each other to survive. The T remained the symbol. Even Americans who never worked with Australians heard about the T breaks. The practice spread through the special operations community until teams everywhere incorporated similar rituals. Not always tea, sometimes coffee, sometimes just enforced pause. But the principle remained: create space where rank disappears. where honest communication happens, where the mission matters more than ego. The ritual looked unmilitary to outsiders. To operators, it was a tactical necessity. The conversations that happened during those breaks prevented failures that would have cost lives. The honesty that emerged in those moments of manufactured equality was worth more than perfect military courtesy. This understanding never penetrated conventional forces where hierarchy was too entrenched. But in small units operating without support, where survival depended on every person functioning at maximum effectiveness, the lesson stuck. Drop the ceremony when it gets in the way. Focus on what actually matters. Trust competence regardless of where you find it. The reckoning came in 1975 when Saigon fell and military analysts began assessing what had worked and what hadn't across 13 years of American involvement. The Australian methodology emerged in classified reports as one of the few bright spots. Small unit operations conducted with Australian methods had consistently outperformed conventional operations by every metric that mattered. Better intelligence, fewer casualties, more sustainable operational tempo. The analysts recommended comprehensive review of American small unit doctrine, incorporating Australian lessons. The recommendations were filed and ignored. The war was over. The institutional desire to learn from failure didn't extend to acknowledging that allies had understood things Americans missed. The official narrative became that American forces had been betrayed by political leadership, that military effectiveness had been hamstrung by restrictive engagement rules. That victory would have been possible with different strategic choices. These narratives had truth in them. They also deflected from harder questions about whether American military culture had been optimized for the wrong kind of war. The harder question was whether respect itself had different meanings in different contexts. American military culture treated respect as a universal constant. You showed it the same way regardless of circumstances, because consistency reinforced structure. Australian military culture treated respect as contextual. You showed it differently, depending on whether you were in garrison or field, whether you were conducting ceremony or combat, whether you needed hierarchy or effectiveness. Neither approach was objectively correct. They reflected different priorities. Americans prioritized organizational consistency because they operated the largest military in history across global deployments. The system needed to function the same way everywhere, or it would fragment into chaos. Australians prioritized operational effectiveness because they operated small forces without resources to absorb failure. The system needed to produce results, or men died. Both priorities were valid. The conflict came from assuming your priority should be everyone's priority. Lieutenant Commander Warren, who had written the original memo about professional respect, retired in 1976. He spent his retirement teaching at Naval Postgraduate School, where he continued arguing for contextual approaches to military culture. He told students about the Australians, about the tea breaks, about learning that respect has different languages. Some students understood immediately. Others never got it. Warren could predict which students would thrive in special operations and which would struggle based entirely on how they reacted to the Australian story. Students who were offended by Australian informality, who felt disrespect was disrespect regardless of context, who believed military courtesy couldn't be negotiable, these students would struggle in environments where effectiveness mattered more than appearance. Students who understood the Australians were making rational adaptations to their operational environment, who could separate social courtesy from professional respect, who recognized that different contexts required different behaviors. These students would thrive. Warren was selected for cognitive flexibility, for ability to function across cultural boundaries, for understanding that professionalism takes many forms. The American lieutenant from that first encounter, whose name was Michael Morrison, also retired and also taught. He told the story differently than Warren. Morrison emphasized his own transformation, his journey from rigid, hierarchical thinking to understanding that leadership meant facilitating effectiveness rather than demanding deference. He told students about the moment he realized the Australian sergeant wasn't being disrespectful. The sergeant was testing whether Morrison would prioritize ego or mission. Morrison had chosen a mission. That choice had saved lives. The sergeant nodded. That nod had contained more respect than any salute Morrison ever received. Morrison taught that story for 20 years, watching students process it, seeing which ones understood and which ones didn't. The ones who understood it tended to be students who had actual combat experience, who had seen what happened when officers prioritized their authority over team effectiveness. The ones who didn't understand were usually junior officers fresh from academy, still believing that leadership meant being obeyed without question. Morrison couldn't teach them. Experience had to teach them. Either they would learn before it got someone killed, or they wouldn't. The Australian soldiers from that first encounter went back to their lives without drama or recognition. They had been doing their jobs, nothing more, certainly nothing that deserved attention. The idea that their normal procedures had seemed revolutionary to Americans would have puzzled them. This was just how you operated in the jungle. Anyone who did it differently was making mistakes that would eventually cost lives. The Americans had learned. Good. That meant fewer Allied casualties in future operations. That was all that mattered. The Australian military culture didn't celebrate warriors or create hero narratives. It acknowledged service, absorbed lessons, and moved on. Men who had done difficult things in difficult places came home, resumed normal lives, carried their experiences privately. The tea they had drunk in the jungle was just tea. The informality that had shocked Americans was just common sense. The competence-based hierarchy that had seemed radical was just pragmatism. They had no sense that they had taught anything profound. They had just shown Americans what worked, and Americans had eventually figured it out. The broader transformation that emerged from this cultural collision shaped American special operations for decades. Delta Force, formed in 1977, incorporated Australian organizational principles from inception. Flexible hierarchy based on competence rather than rank. Minimal ceremony. Honest communication regardless of status differences. These characteristics were presented as innovations developed specifically for counterterrorism missions. In reality, they were Australian lessons learned in Vietnam and adapted to new contexts. The adaptation worked. Delta became the most effective counterterrorism force in the American military, precisely because it had abandoned the hierarchical rigidity that constrained conventional units. The irony was complete. American special operations had become effective by adopting methods that looked unprofessional to conventional military, methods that Americans had initially dismissed as disrespectful when Australians demonstrated them. The epilogue to this story is still being written. Every time an American officer working in a coalition operation encounters Allied forces with different customs, different protocols, and different ideas about what professionalism looks like, the same decision point emerges. Judge by appearance, or judge by results. Demand conformity to American expectations, or accept that effectiveness takes many forms. The officers who learned from Australians in Vietnam taught their students to choose results over appearance. Those students taught their students the same lesson. The lesson propagates through generations now, carried in stories about tea breaks and sergeants who didn't salute, and the moment when American pride gave way to understanding that respect means trusting someone's competence rather than demanding. They acknowledge your authority. The lesson is fragile. Every generation includes officers who value ceremony over substance, who confuse deference with respect, who believe their way is the only professional way. These officers create friction. In coalition operations, alienate allies, limit effectiveness through rigidity. They can't be changed through argument. They can only be worked around until experience teaches them or removes them. The teacup sits now in the Australian War Memorial, donated by a veteran who carried it through 3 years of jungle operations. The cup is battered metal, worn smooth, by handling, stained by 10,000 brews. The placard beside it mentions its use in Vietnam, but says nothing about what it represented. The tea breaks, the manufactured equality, the space where rank disappeared and honest communication happened, the symbol that Americans initially misunderstood and eventually adopted. The memorial visitors walk past without recognizing significance. Just an old cup, unremarkable, but for men who understand the story, the cup represents something profound. It represents the moment when American military culture encountered a different way of showing respect and had to choose between dismissing it or learning from it. The choice was hard. Institutional pride resisted. Individual relationships overcame institutional resistance. Men who needed to work together found ways to bridge cultural gaps. The bridge they built was stronger than anyone expected. Strong enough to survive the war. Strong enough to influence American special operations for half a century. Strong enough that its lessons still matter today. The final truth this story teaches is about humility. Military organizations, especially successful ones, develop institutional confidence that can calcify into arrogance. We know what works. We wrote the doctrine. Others should learn from us. This attitude isn't always wrong. American military effectiveness is real. American operational success across multiple theaters proves the system functions. But the attitude becomes dangerous when it prevents learning from allies who understand things Americans don't. The Australians understood jungle warfare better than Americans because they had been forced to learn it without the cushion of overwhelming resources. They understood small unit operations better because they had no choice. Their entire military was small units. They understood how to operate without support because support was never guaranteed. These were lessons purchased with blood across decades. The Americans could have learned these lessons the same way, could have spent years making mistakes until they figured out what worked. Or they could have learned from allies who already knew. Pride made the choice harder than it should have been. Eventually, necessity forced the right choice. Lives were saved because someone decided that learning from Australians mattered more than maintaining American presumption of superiority. That decision, to learn from unexpected sources, to value effectiveness over pride, to admit that allies might understand things you don't, is the decision every military organization faces constantly. Some organizations make it easy. Others resist until forced by failure. The difference between these approaches is written in casualty reports, in mission success rates, in the effectiveness metrics that reveal whether organizations learn or just repeat the same mistakes with increasing sophistication. The American military learned in Vietnam eventually because operators in the field prioritized survival over pride. The institution learned more slowly, reluctantly, incompletely. But I learned. The evidence is in how modern American special operations function, in the cultural norms they practice, in the leadership philosophies they teach. Australian influence is everywhere once you know to look for it. The tea breaks. The informal communication. The competence-based hierarchy. The understanding that respect takes different forms in different contexts. These are Australian lessons, absorbed and adapted, transmitted across generations, forming part of what makes American special operations effective now. The Australian sergeant who sat in that briefing tent in March 1968, who didn't salute, who drank his tea while the American lieutenant simmered with resentment, probably never knew the impact that moment had. He was just doing his job the way his training had taught him. The offense he caused was unintentional. The lesson he taught was accidental, but the lesson mattered. It rippled through the American Special Operations community, changing how men understood leadership, respect, and effectiveness. The ripples continue. Every operator who learns that rank matters less than competence, that respect means trusting someone rather than deferring to them, that professionalism takes many forms, they are inheriting the lesson that Australian sergeant taught without meaning to teach anything at all. He was just drinking tea, just being himself, just operating the way jungle operations required. The Americans who learned from him carried those lessons forward, teaching others, shaping culture, transforming how American special operations function. That sergeant, whose name is lost to history, whose contribution was never officially acknowledged, shaped modern American military effectiveness more than most generals. He did it by being good at his job and helping others learn to be good at theirs. No ceremony, no recognition, just the work. That's respect of the purest kind.